everyone, and welcome to the February 2025 episode of Diabetes Care on Air, a fun way to bring the research in diabetes care to life. I'm Mike Rickles from the University of Pennsylvania.
And I'm Alice Cheng from the University of Toronto, and we are your co-hosts for this podcast series.
It's February, Alice, and that means Valentine's Day. And for us in the Northern Hemisphere, at least, cold, cold weather.
Cold is definitely a good way to describe it. I think in Toronto recently, it was minus 25 degrees Celsius. I don't know what that is in Fahrenheit, but it's cold.
Down
That's all
there.
I can say. Exactly. Now, on top of that, there are some other fun facts I can share about February that perhaps our listeners were not aware of. Did you know that February is the only month of the year in which one may never see a full moon? And another fun fact is that February is one of the most misspelled words in the English language. Now, this I know because I distinctly remember winning a spelling bee in grade 2 by spelling the word February, which I was very proud of. How's that for useless information?
Well, not quite sure how to respond to that, Alice, other than to say congratulations.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Now, I have a question for you, Mike. In our last episode, your New Year's resolution was to clean out and organize your office full of paper. So how's that going?
Well, I'm going to have to ask you to please give it some more time, Alice. I spent the New Year's holiday with some extra days at home and started another project to update our family photo albums. Now, my home office is covered with piles of photos, and I think I've just made matters worse for myself.
But fun, right? Going through the photos have got to be fun. So let's kick off our February 2025 episode. As per usual, we will each interview authors of feature articles as selected by the editors of Diabetes Care.
And we will end things off with our popular Rapid Exchange segment, where we discuss some of the articles we found particularly interesting. Let's get started.
One of the feature articles from the February 2025 issue of Diabetes Care is a fantastic Perspectives in Care entitled Glycemic Management and Individualized Diabetes Care in Dialysis-Dependent Kidney Failure by Dr. Klara Klein and colleagues. I'm joined by the first author, Dr. Klara Klein, MD, Ph.D., endocrinologist from the University of North Carolina School of Medicine. Thank you very much, Klara, for agreeing to be part of this podcast, and congratulations to you and your colleagues.
Thank you so much for having me. It's really an honor to be here.
Well, to get us started, why was it that you and your colleagues felt that this topic needed such a review?
Well, as this audience will appreciate, diabetes is the primary cause of kidney failure for nearly half of the people treated with dialysis in the United States. Unfortunately, people treated with dialysis are at extremely high risk of death, largely secondary to cardiovascular causes. And those living with diabetes are at even higher risk of cardiovascular and all-cause mortality. And yet there's very little population-specific evidence to guide diabetes management in people treated with dialysis. I think it's important to understand that the dialysis population is unique for many reasons, not only because of differences in drug metabolism, but because dialysis and kidney failure-related factors impact glycemic measures, they increase symptom burden, and they can lead to differences in the risk-benefit profiles of the agents that we use in the general diabetes population. With this perspective, we hope to shed light on some of the challenges associated with diabetes care in people living with dialysis-dependent kidney disease. And perhaps more importantly, while we hope to highlight the need for population-specific evidence, we wanted to emphasize that individualized, person-centered diabetes care should be offered even in the absence of dialysis-specific data.
So all fantastic reasons, and I think everybody listening to this podcast, in fact, has an opportunity to serve people who would fit into this category. So I think we all have a lot to learn. So let's dive in. And I'm going to start off with glucose control. Now, glucose control is, of course, critical in the management of diabetes. I mean, we're speaking to an audience that reads diabetes care, and guidelines around the world have generally recommended consistent targets. But what about people living with diabetes and dialysis-dependent kidney failure? And this may sound like a blasphemous question, but does glucose control actually matter in that population?
Yeah, I think this is a really important question. And the short answer is yes. We know from landmark trials that glucose control in the general diabetes population primarily impacts microvascular disease. So, what do we do when someone has evidence of significant microvascular disease? They've had a seminal event like kidney failure. Does tight glycemic control remain important? And while there are no randomized controlled trials of intensive glycemic control in people who are treated with dialysis, observational data overwhelmingly suggests that extremes of glycemia associate with mortality in the dialysis population. So paying attention to glucose control remains important.
Now, typical glucose targets are centered around HbA1c. What are the considerations, though, in this particular population, and what target should we be aiming for?
So the accuracy of hemoglobin A1c is impacted by a variety of dialysis-related factors, including but not limited to altered red blood cell turnover. And as a result, it's very difficult to interpret hemoglobin A1c in people who are treated with dialysis. And so it creates a barrier for really defining a true hemoglobin A1c target in people treated with dialysis. It's therefore not terribly surprising that few guidelines offer hemoglobin A1c targets for the dialysis population. The most concrete guidelines come from the Joint British Diabetes Society and the UK Kidney Association, and they suggest a very wide range. A hemoglobin A1c less than 6.5% and greater than 9.5% indicates poor control. So it's really important to individualize hemoglobin A1c based on the person sitting in front of you. Tighter glycemic control may be warranted for younger individuals or those who are working towards transplant, whereas you might consider looser control for people who have demonstrated significant risk for hypoglycemia, having had significant hypoglycemia or frailty. The key really is that glucose targets need to be individualized.
So, what about alternative measures to HbA1c then? Because you mentioned all the potential issues around HbA1c. And then what about CGM?
Yeah, so other measures of glycemia like fructosamine and glycated albumin are not validated in people treated with dialysis and therefore not recommended for use. Continuous glucose monitoring, on the other hand, has significant potential, but again, data is lacking. So, questions remain like, can we apply the same CGM targets that we use in the general population to those treated with dialysis? And the answer is we don't really know. But that doesn't mean we shouldn't use them. It's just important to understand that CGM accuracy in people treated with dialysis hasn't fully been evaluated. So when you're interpreting CGM data, it needs to be interpreted with caution, and capillary glucose checks should strongly be encouraged in situations of potential discordance.
So, all good pieces of advice. Now, there's a line in the paper that I really, really liked, and I read it several times because I liked it so much. The line says, fixation on the prevention of hypoglycemia may result in harmful hyperglycemia or inhibit use of disease modifying therapies that are indicated irrespective of HbA1c. So, Klara, can you expand on that? And are there particular populations that you were thinking about when that line was written?
Yeah, it's nice you picked up on a critical line in our paper, which is great. So I think current guidelines emphasize the very high risk of hypoglycemia in people with dialysis-dependent kidney disease. Certainly, recognizing the risk of hypoglycemia is important in this population, but without also citing the evidence demonstrating that glycemia still impacts overall outcomes, one might solely focus on hypoglycemia prevention and allow for permissive hyperglycemia, which also may be a problem. So I think it's important just to understand the whole picture. Maybe more importantly, if we choose really to fixate purely on prevention of hypoglycemia, it may restrict people from considering initiation of glucose lowering agents that may also modify cardiovascular disease risk, disease modifying therapies that have benefits independent of glycemia. Because people living with diabetes and dialysis dependent kidney disease are by definition at extremely high risk of cardiovascular disease, we really should consider agents that might improve cardiovascular disease risk in all people with type 2 diabetes who are treated with dialysis.
Again, great advice. So let's talk a bit more specifics then. So let's talk about the actual glucose lowering medication options that we have. And within the document, you provide a table that very nicely summarizes the FDA approved meds in the dialysis population, which of course include insulin, DPP4 inhibitors, GLP-1 receptor agonists, sulfonylureas, and pioglitazone. And you also provide a table that summarizes the published evidence for the use of those medications in this population. So, with that in mind, though, can we focus our attention on the GLP-1 receptor agonist specifically? Because I mean, for many reasons, but one is what you alluded to in your previous answer about the potential cardiovascular benefits. So, what are the particular considerations of using GLP-1 RAs in this population?
Yeah, I think, this really gets back to the other question, which is, should we be using disease modifying therapies in people who are treated with dialysis? So use of incretin therapy in the dialysis population is really limited, with less than 4% of people treated with hemodialysis receiving incretin therapy in 2021. And again, I sound like a broken record here, but we lack evidence to support their use. However, we know from the FLOW trial that semaglutide improves major adverse cardiovascular events in people with moderate to severe chronic kidney disease. People treated with dialysis were excluded from the FLOW trial, so whether the cardiovascular benefits extend to people treated with dialysis is really not established. However, in the absence of clinical trials, shared decision-making should allow for use of these therapies with the potential to improve cardiovascular outcomes in this high-risk population. It's important to understand that these medicines may have different or worse adverse effects in the dialysis population. For example, somewhere between 70 and 90% of people treated dialysis experience nausea at baseline. So when starting incretin therapy, which may induce GI adverse effects, titration may need to be much slower, and the dose titration increments might need to be smaller than we typically use in the general population. And so just taking those types of adverse effects into mind and understanding how it might need to change for someone who's experiencing the symptom burden of dialysis is really important.
So, sort of start low, go slow, I think concept very much applies here.
Exactly.
Now, what about SGLT2 inhibitors then? Not indicated in this group, but what do we know and why might someone still consider using it off label in this population?
Yeah, I think SGLT2 inhibitors are increasingly being used off label, where people are being maintained on their SGLT2 inhibitors. There are two primary reasons that SGLT2 inhibitors might be used in this population, and there are studies that are ongoing. First, preserved residual kidney function among people receiving dialysis is an important predictor of lower mortality risk. So, people who are treated with dialysis who still produce urine may benefit from SGLT2 inhibitor effectiveness for slowing the decline of kidney function. And secondly, just like we discussed previously with incretin therapies, the cardiovascular effects of SGLT2 inhibitors may also benefit people treated with dialysis. Somewhere around 77% of people treated with hemodialysis have known cardiovascular disease, 45% have congestive heart failure, and 44% have coronary artery disease. And so, just like with incretin therapies, these agents that we know are beneficial in the general population may confer benefits to people treated with dialysis independent of diabetes or glycemia.
And as I listen to this, I mean, you've already alluded to the fact that there's not a lot of specific evidence or trials done in this population. But then I'm reminded of a saying I had heard is that the absence of evidence is not evidence of absence of benefit. I may be saying it wrong, but that concept is, I think, valid here. I mean, we're not saying there is evidence, but then the fact that it hasn't been done doesn't mean there isn't evidence.
Yeah, I think in my feeling is that, this is a population that really deserves to hear the risks and benefits, as does everyone. But, understanding that there's not data, you know, it doesn't mean that we shouldn't try. We just
Correct.
have to understand that it may not be the same, but, as long as we, evaluate what's happening with the person sitting in front of us and there's not evidence of significant harm, it's worth a shot.
Yeah. Now let's move to specific populations within the dialysis dependent group. What are considerations in those that live with type 1 diabetes?
Yeah, it's funny, as little data as I have described, or we talk about for people living with type 2 diabetes and dialysis dependent kidney disease, there's even less for people with type 1 diabetes and dialysis dependent kidney disease. So the technologies that have become standard of care in the general type 1 diabetes population have not been specifically tested in dialysis. For example, there are limited data, there are some, but very limited data to suggest safety of automated insulin delivery in dialysis dependent kidney disease. We really don't know how peridialysis changes in insulin sensitivity and clearance affect automated insulin delivery algorithms. And so again, it doesn't mean that we can't use these systems, but they need to be used with caution. And when we use them, there should be strong encouragement to use capillary blood glucose testing to ensure that CGM is accurate and to maintain an off-pump plan in case of emergencies.
And then what about peritoneal dialysis?
So in peritoneal dialysis, typically a glucose-based dialysis solution is instilled in the abdomen, and osmotic forces facilitate toxin and fluid removal and electrolyte homeostasis. And the dextrose that's used can be absorbed and worsen hyperglycemia. In people who have high fluid removal needs, icodextrin, which is a slow resorbing glucose polymer, can be used in place of glucose-based solutions. But icodextrin is known to react with some glucose sensor electrodes and can falsely raise glucose readings. And so what I would say about peritoneal dialysis is that it's really important to understand what dialysis solution is being used in people treated with peritoneal dialysis, because it may impact treatment and you might change what you do based on their dialysis solution.
Now, a common theme throughout the review, and we've already alluded to this in our discussion, is the paucity of evidence in this population. So why is that? Like, why is it that this population traditionally not been included in diabetes research? And where do we go from here for research in this area?
Yeah, I mean, conduct of clinical trials in the dialysis population is challenging, and it's challenging for many, many reasons. There are significant barriers, including, and again, not limited to, burden of comorbid conditions, transportation constraints, the burden of thrice weekly dialysis, and there's some research mistrust. But there's also enormous possibility to improve outcomes if we can overcome those barriers. So I think cultivating a dialysis clinic culture where research and clinical care are synergistic is essential to research success in the dialysis environment. I think bringing research to the dialysis clinic is going to be key. Further, it will be really, really important to incorporate input from the dialysis community in clinical trial design, because that will help facilitate feasible and acceptable research to the people who are actually conducting and participating in the research. So I think it's fair to say that the challenges for research in the dialysis population are, there are a lot of them. The challenges are undeniable, but they're also surmountable, and I think have the potential to lead to really important and meaningful outcome improvements.
And finally, what are the big takeaways that you want our listeners to have after reading your paper?
Yeah, I hope that after people read our paper, that we have successfully conveyed the compelling need to improve diabetes and cardiovascular outcomes among people living with diabetes and dialysis-dependent kidney disease. The advances that we've seen revolutionize diabetes care in the non-dialysis population offer hope that population-specific evidence could support similar outcome improvements in the dialysis population. But I guess most importantly, I hope that diabetes care listeners recognize that even in the absence of population-specific evidence, which we hope is coming, but even in its absence, we have the opportunity to offer and should offer patient-centered, holistic diabetes care that's tailored to individuals living with diabetes and dialysis-dependent kidney disease.
Wise words. So thank you. Thank you very much, Dr. Klara Klein, for sharing your expertise with us today. And congratulations to you and your colleagues for this important perspectives in care on this important topic that has perhaps been neglected for too long. I encourage our listeners to read the full review in the February issue of Diabetes Care.
In the February 2025 issue of Diabetes Care is a feature article entitled Lessons Learned from Epidemiology of Type 2 Diabetes in South Asians, the Kelly West Award Lecture 2024. I'm delighted to welcome the article's author and 2024 Kelly West Award recipient, Dr. Viswanathan Mohan. Dr. Mohan is president and chief of diabetes research at the Madras Diabetes Research Foundation and chair and chief diabetologist of Dr. Mohan's Diabetes Specialties Center in Chennai, India. The Kelly West Award is given by the American Diabetes Association each year to an individual in recognition for outstanding achievement in epidemiology. While Kelly West is widely regarded as the father of diabetes epidemiology, Dr. Mohan is unquestionably the father of diabetes epidemiology in South Asians. Congratulations, Viswanathan, on your Kelly West Award lecture and this feature article.
Thank you so much, Dr. Rickles. It's a great honor for me to not only deliver the Kelly West lecture and receive the award at the last ADA, but also to take part in this podcast. Thank you very much for having me on the show.
Thank you for joining us for this episode. Now, before we get to the science, the story of your career is also quite remarkable. And while I was enjoying reading about it online, I was hoping you could tell us a little more about how you became involved in diabetes research and investigating the epidemiology of type 2 diabetes in South Asians.
Thank you very much. It's a very personal story, but I would love to say this. So, my father, late Professor M. Viswanathan, is widely considered as the father of diabetology in India. He is like the Jocelyn of the United States. And so, he started the first diabetic clinic in India in 1948, just after the British left. He continued there and he would have probably retired, and I would never have taken up medicine. But it so happened, this is just serendipity. So what happened was that when he was still had a few years left to retire, he had to leave for some political reasons. He had to leave. And so he had to set up his own private diabetes center. So he called me as I was his eldest son and asked me to take up medicine. So I want to do English literature and become a poet and a writer and so on. And so he said, no, I need somebody to help me, and you will definitely get into medicine because you topped the university. So why don't you change tracks and take up medicine? And he said, you can do a lot of scientific writing. Why do you want to do, poetry and something? Why don't you do scientific writing? So that kind of set the ball rolling. And I said, okay, I'll join you. So at the age of 18, actually, when I joined medical school, I joined my father. The reason was that if I was going to wait until I finished my undergraduate, postgraduate, and finished my Ph.D., he'll be too old and there's no point in working for him. So I said, okay, let me work from day one with you. And he had a lot of medical records of his patients. And I insisted that he also builds a small lab for me. So we had a garage where everything starts in a garage, right from from Steve Jobs and everybody starts in a garage. And I also started in a garage. So we got a few rats and mice and we hired a biochemist and then started doing research, proper research, when I was 18 years old, long before I had finished my anatomy, physiology, or my first year of MBBS, my undergraduate course. And then from there on, there was no looking back. And I started getting more and more into diabetes. Now, the epidemiology part came a little later because we were clinicians and doing mostly clinical work. I realized sometime after, so I worked with my father for 20 years and then later on started on my own group of institutions at Sir Dr. Mohan's diabetes centers. Then I realized that I didn't have any control group. Everybody who came to see us had diabetes. And so I didn't know what is a normal level of cholesterol or blood pressure in the normal population, because everybody who comes to me has diabetes. So I said, this isn't good. We should get some epidemiological data. So we started with the first studies, baby steps in epidemiology, a couple of small places in Chennai, the nearest I could find. That's convenient sampling. Once you get into epidemiology, you realize that's not enough. People said, oh, it's not a representative sample. Then I had to do the whole of Chennai. Then they said, oh, Chennai is only a city. You have to do the whole of India. So then the whole India study came. That's called as ICMR INDIAB study. Then they said, why are you doing only India? Why don't you do the whole world? So we had the pure study, the prospective urban rural epidemiological study, which Dr. Salim Youssef from McMaster University, Canada does. So we're part of that. Then we joined Dr. Venkat Narayan from Emory University and set up the famous CAUSE study funded by NIH. And so more and more work on epidemiology started going. And so truly we got really entrenched into epidemiology of South Asians, learned a lot. And that was what my Kelly West lecture was all about.
Well, that's just a terrific legacy you've established for your father, and I'm sure he could not be more proud of all you've done with your interest in studying English and writing and how you've applied that to scientific writing as you've been most prolific in educating the world about diabetes in South Asians. And your article explains how the increased prevalence of type 2 diabetes affecting South Asians was first recognized in South Asians living abroad, but has since shifted back to the Indian subcontinent. How did this evolve?
Very interesting. And I think that was the kind of crux of the Kelly West lecture. So when I joined my father, he had a famous saying, a quotation. He said, the diabetes is mainly a migrant Indian or migrant South Asian phenomenon. And the reason for that was that in the 1970s, India was quite poor. We were still importing food from the United States under the PL 480 scheme. Ships would come with wheat, and that's how India survived. We had to literally buy food and get food from the United States to survive. Then came the Green Revolution, where we started growing our own food, rice, wheat. Today we are a food exporter. We have so much of food. So that is one change which occurred. But it's still, see, the Indians who went abroad, South Asians who went abroad, when I say India, it's the Indian subcontinent. So you have Pakistan, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, Bhutan, Nepal, Afghanistan. They're basically the same region. And so mass migration started taking place to US, Canada, Middle East, Singapore, Malaysia. So the people who went there were generally bright. They were, into the United States, for example, doctors, lawyers, the best professionals went. So when they went there, they became rich. They bought their own cars, and now they had their own house, and they could eat well, and they put on weight, and they became obese. And so diabetes rates there went up very significantly. While in India, the poor country, still importing food and so on, nothing was happening. And that's clearly brought out in the lecture as well as in the article which is going to be published. 1991, something significant happened. India became completely bankrupt. And so we had actually sold all our gold and everything in the country. So at that time, a major decision was taken to open up the economy. We said, if we don't open up the economy, we are finished. So we allowed foreign investments to come in. When foreign investments came in, the country's economy boomed. So we had all the American companies, British companies, German, Japanese, all coming in. And then suddenly the economy boomed. People are earning more money. Then we started putting on weight. We started getting more diabetes. Our life expectancy went up. All the communicable disease went down. Non-communicable disease like diabetes, hypertension, obesity, heart disease, they all went up. We had all the fast food chains coming to India. And so it was a complete revolution. So within 10 years, the whole profile had changed. And then we kept going more and more, while in the West, by this time, the people who had gone there, they started realizing that their health was getting affected. So they started exercising, joining gyms, watching their weight. They quit smoking. They started eating healthy, eating salads, doing all the right things. In India, that still hasn't come. Only in the uppermost society that it has happened. So the rest of India, the middle class is still growing and so on. So in somewhere in 2015 or so, I wanted to revisit that question. Is my father still right that it is a migrant Indian phenomenon, migrant South Asian phenomenon? So we compared the Indians living in the Bay Area in California and in northern Chicago, the Masala study, with our CAR study funded by the NIH with Dr. Venkat Narayan and colleagues from Emory University. And to our surprise, we found that in Chennai, the city where I live, diabetes rates are actually much higher than in the Indians in the United States. So it is no longer true that it's a migrant Indian phenomenon. It's now much more a disease of affluence. So in a way, it's good. I mean, it's a sign of progress. You're living longer. Your life expectancy is going up. You'll have more diabetes because you're older now. From malnutrition, undernutrition, you're going to normal weight and to overnutrition now, which is again bound to happen because you're now having motorized transport where people went by walk or cycling. Now they have scooters, cars, so their physical activity is going down. So it's a price that we pay. So the transition from a kind of poor, impoverished state to an affluent state is good in a way. It's good for the country, it's good for everything. But the price you pay is obesity and diabetes. And we are paying that price now.
So the Indian subcontinent has seen this delayed industrial revolution that's experienced earlier in the West, and with many similar parallels to both the good side and the bad side of increased wealth, access to food, and the risk for overweight and overnutrition. But you note importantly how South Asians develop type 2 diabetes at a younger age and at a lower body mass index or BMI than white Europeans. Why is this observed? And what is unique about this diabetes development in South Asians?
You have really caught the point very well. So that's one of the unique features, and this has been a mystery right from the 1980s and 90s, because I mentioned that when the Indians and South Asians went abroad, they got more diabetes. That is not surprising because they have become more affluent. But in all the studies done at that time, when you compared with the local population in Malaysia, in Singapore, with the Chinese population, with the Malay population, in Europe or UK, Canada, US, with the white population, the black population, and other populations, the Indians, the South Asians always had the highest prevalence of diabetes and at a younger age, and not necessarily with the same rate of obesity or the same degree of obesity. So, this suggests that there is some genetic factor which has been operating in our population. We still don't know why, but when you look at the genes which are associated with insulin secretion, for example, and obesity is more associated with insulin resistance. So when you study the genes associated with insulin secretion, they seem to be more affected in the South Asians. And we've got a lot of studies to show that, which means that the genetic factor seems to be quite strong. On top of that, there are other factors. For example, carbohydrate intake is very high in the South Asians. If you look at white rice, for example, South Asians consume 3 to 4 times as amount of white rice as, say, a European population and so on. So this carbohydrate, when you take too much of carbohydrate, what happens is you're pulling out all the insulin from the beta cells. And if you already have a weak pancreas, which is genetically prone to get it because you have some genes enriched in that population, perhaps due to inbreeding, due to consanguineous marriages. There are others in India who have other theories as well. They say there's B12 deficiency, so that the mother intrauterine itself is programmed to develop beta cell failure. And there could be genetic factors. On top of that, when you add the excess carb intake, we take 60 to 70% of our diet from carbs, and we take very little protein, very little fiber. And there's a lot of vegetarian food. And again, this is all coming from carbs, refined carbs. So that's definitely one of the reasons. Yet another new risk factor which we have found is pollution. So air pollution, which I know in places like California and so on have been controlled very well. You had that many years ago. As you rightly said, we are like 10 years or 15 years behind you in everything. So as far as the pollution is concerned, we were probably where you were 15, 20 years ago. And we have now found direct links to type 2 diabetes. So if you have a lot of pollution, that particle PM2.5 particle matter being more, then it affects the beta cells, it affects insulin resistance, insulin action, and produces diabetes. And this occurs in lean people. You don't need to necessarily have obesity. So it doesn't mean that obesity doesn't produce diabetes. Yes, of course it does. Like you see in the white European population, it does. But it also affects lean people who have a strong family history of diabetes, and they seem to get it at a very young age because it is not driven by obesity necessarily. So we are still doing a lot of work on that, trying to find out which genes are affected, and is it epigenetic mechanisms rather than genetic mechanisms as such. So a lot of work is going on in this, but you're right. This concept of lean, thin, young people who get type 2 diabetes is quite common. We're not even sure whether it's a different type of diabetes or it's just an extension of type 2 occurring in the young, and a lot more work needs to be done.
Yeah, and there's been great interest in understanding this heterogeneity of type 2 diabetes and all the various subtypes or endotypes, depending on what terminology you prefer. And clearly, your work is elucidating mechanisms beyond what we know about age and obesity associated type 2 diabetes that can likely apply to all populations and where subgroups exist that share similar phenotypic features. And what was most striking to me was learning that the differences in body composition, including disproportionate increases in fat mass, are present already at birth in South Asians. And so, What is unique about the intrauterine environment? And you mentioned vitamin B12 already. So, how does that link work? And what has this meant for diabetes development in offspring of women of South Asian descent?
So the lot of work has come from Pune, from the work of Dr. Yajnik, my colleague, who believes strongly in the Barker hypothesis. And the view that they have is that when the mother is malnourished or undernourished, and it could be B12, he also believes it's excess folate given during pregnancy, which can work adversely. It could also just be calorie malnutrition or protein calorie malnutrition. So what happens is that the baby is born small, but because of this dysmetabolism which occurs, it may be related to B12, it may be related to genetic factors, it may be related to other factors which we still don't know. It may be pollution, maybe something else. We still don't know. But what happens is that the child is born with a smaller pancreas, with less number of beta cells. That means a child is already programmed at the time of birth. And when you look at the small Indian baby, and compare that baby with a white European baby born in, say, London. The white European baby is bigger, the body size is bigger, the weight is bigger. But if you look at the insulin level, it's higher in the Indian baby. If you look at the leptin levels as a measure of fat, and if you actually measure the amount of fat, if you do a CT or an MRI and measure how much of fat is there, particularly inside the abdomen, the visceral fat, it's already more in the Indian baby. So we call it as the thin fat Indian. It's thin and small, but it's fat. There's more fat. So that more recently, and I've referred to that in the paper as well, there's some very elegant work which came out from Glasgow. Very interesting. And that kind of nailed the whole thing. Why is this visceral fat and intra-abdominal fat more in Indians was not known. So what they did in Glasgow, just published study, was that they overfed the South Asians in Glasgow, and they overfed volunteers. They called people, they didn't have diabetes, and they said, we're going to overfeed you. Can you participate in these experiments? So a group of white Europeans and a group of South Asians participated in this. Now, when they gave them the same kind of food and the same amount of calories, excess calories, of course, more than what they would normally eat, what happened was that in the Europeans, two things happened. Of course, they gained weight. Everybody gains weight. But they gained fat and they gained muscle. So there was some muscle development also occurring in the white European. And then when they looked at where that fat had accumulated, it was more outside the body in the subcutaneous fat region of the abdomen and not inside the abdomen. Whereas in the South Asians, what happened was there was very little in the subcutaneous tissue, but more of it went into the visceral fat inside and then straight into the liver, and the liver started filling up with fat. Then they started doing biopsies and they looked at MRIs and very carefully, why is this happening? They found that the South Asians, they had the small adipocytes, which can fill up and grow in size when you feed them. The numbers of those small adipocytes were much lower in the South Asians. So what happens is when you start feeding them, the number of these cells which are there quickly fill up and then there's no more. So they have to move. There's an overflow of the fat. And the fat then gets into the intra-abdominal or the visceral. And from there, it has to move into the liver. And so it goes and settles. So you get fatty liver, what we now call as MASLD, or the metabolic associated steatotic liver disease, earlier called NAFLD or non-alcoholic fatty liver disease. That's very high. And it occurs even without BMI of 30 or 40, the usual BMI definitions of diabetes, even in thinner people, because these cells get filled up. Now, whether it is genetic or not, or we are pre-programmed from it through intrauterine, is something which needs to be studied. It's probably a bit of both. Probably there are some genes which predispose us because of centuries of acculturalization and especially consanguinity. You know, there's a lot of intermarriages occurring because cousins tend to marry, and uncle and a niece gets married. That these kind of things don't exist in Western society. These are very common to keep the wealth within the community and for various other, because caste systems and so on. So because of that, the genes get multiplied. So these genes are probably becoming unfavorable now that we have more food to eat. Maybe at the time of famine, it protected us. But today we don't have famine. And so we are having an excess overdose of it. and so getting more of the diabetes and the obesity due to that. So that's why that fat composition seems to be very different. And that seems to be a key driver of the initial phase of hyperinsulinemia and insulin resistance, quickly leading to beta cell failure. Because the beta cells are already programmed from birth to be having less beta cells, smaller beta cell number, and so they'll fail very easily. They may not, if they maintain a very healthy lifestyle, they remain thin and they don't eat too much carbs and they take more protein and they build their muscle and so on. If they do that, probably they can prevent diabetes. But if you follow the unhealthy route and put on weight and take too much of carbs and so on, it very quickly shifts you into diabetes.
So it seems that there's a much lower threshold for metabolic syndrome development. And I always wonder about the thiazolidinedione class of medications that helps to differentiate and mature subcutaneous adipocytes, and yet can cause weight gain in individuals who maintain caloric excess, but in lean individuals with metabolic syndrome can have a tremendous effect on preventing ectopic fat accumulation and diabetes development. Is that class used in South Asians?
Yeah, they are used, but problem with those drugs is that there are also side effects. So apart from weight gain, fluid overload, some retinal changes, occasional incidences of bladder cancer, and so on. And so because of that, they're used, but they're not very popular. But the SGLT2s, they seem to work very well in our population. And some of the drugs like DPP4s, which don't work very well in the white European population, they're considered placebos in the US, but they work very well in our population because they stimulate the beta cell function just enough. The sulfonylureas overstimulate them, whereas the DPP4s, they work through glucagon, so they work very well. SGLT2s work very well. We don't have too much data on GLP-1, especially the semaglutide parenteral has not come, but semaglutide oral has come. That is working quite well, and where there is some weight gain, because although we are not obese by the Western standards, there is still excess weight, there's still excess fat. So any loss of that fat is beneficial. And of course, the TZDs can also be used. But in the prevention trials which we have done, we have found that certain groups, for example, there's another differentiation between South Asians and the white Europeans. In the white Europeans, a majority of pre-diabetes is impaired glucose tolerance, IGT. Whereas the majority of the pre-diabetes in South Asians and Southeast Asians, as shown in a major report which is published in Diabetes Care, is impaired fasting glucose, IFG. So IFG does not respond so well to prevention. We showed that in the DCLIP trial, and many other trials have shown that. So while IGT responds, the DPP was done, the diabetes prevention program was done mainly in people with IGT. The Finnish study was done mainly in people with IGT. The Daqing study in China was done mainly in people with IGT. But when we did the DCLIP study where we included IFG and IGT, the IGTs responded. But the IFGs, the impaired fasting glucose people with the pre-diabetes, they didn't respond. And that's a major type of pre-diabetes in our population. Majority have the IFG type. Maybe that's a reason why they don't respond to prevention as well as the white Europeans who have the IGT type more. So as we keep studying this, we pick up newer and newer nuances of this and newer differences, which are fascinating, which opens up more things to be done, more research to be done in the field.
And also identifies important targets to treat mechanistically for finding effective prevention interventions. And I want to go back to what you said earlier about air pollution. And Alice brought up a study linking air pollution to diabetes development in East Asians in the January episode last month. And you explain how air pollution is now recognized as a novel factor affecting the prevalence of type 2 diabetes in South Asians. And I just want to talk about that a little bit more, and any thoughts you have on what can be done about it, either on an individual or on a societal level.
So yes, the mechanisms behind the air pollution is being worked out. So two defects are definitely coming up. One is a direct beta cell effect because it's an endocrine disruptor. Just like you have the bisphenols and other things coming in, air pollution, the particulate matter, they can directly go and attack the beta cells. We saw that with COVID as well, isn't it? That when you have a virus, it can directly go and attack the beta cells. So that is one aspect of it. The second is that it produces inflammation, and inflammation is linked to obesity, and obesity is linked to insulin resistance. So on one side, there is insulin secretory defect being worsened, and on the other side, you have the insulin resistance. And these are the two pathophysiological defects for type 2 diabetes. And if both are going to get affected, you have more of type 2 diabetes. So we had a paper recently, which I quoted in this paper. We looked at the cars study again in Delhi and in Chennai. In Delhi has much more pollution and in Chennai, the levels are much higher. So we looked at new onset diabetes. So we had done the baseline study where we had ruled out everyone who had diabetes, and those who didn't have diabetes, we followed them up for 10 years and measured the pollution levels and looked at the new onset type 2 diabetes, incident diabetes, and looked at its correlation with pollution. Pretty strong correlation came out, both in Delhi as well as in Chennai, stronger in Delhi than in Chennai because pollution is stronger. So we had not thought that this is going to be an independent risk factor, because we always think of the classic, does your family history of diabetes, do you have obesity, do you do physical activity? These are the usual things we talk about. Is your diet unhealthy? Are you taking sugar sweetened beverages? This is the usual thing. We don't ask about pollution. No, do you live in a polluted place? And so now, as you rightly said, this opens up a window of opportunity to prevent diabetes. So suppose you wear a mask like we wore during COVID days, and if you don't take in the pollution, the particulate matter, can this have a good effect? So that will be a study worth doing. If you wear a mask, and it's difficult to do a long-term study, of course, but at least short-term, looking at changes in insulin secretion or C-peptide or whatever in people who wear a mask and don't wear a mask. The second thing is, what is the source of the pollution? So in Delhi, for example, while automobiles and factories and so on are there, but the major source of the pollution in Delhi is coming from the farmers in the neighboring state. So this season, for example, when they finish the harvest season comes, when they have the stubbles of all the crops left, they burn them. And when they burn them, already it is cold. In Delhi, it's quite cold. Chennai, it's not cold, but in Delhi, it's quite cold. So you already have fog, and then you have the smoke coming in, and that doesn't go away so easily. And so you have the whole air is full of smog. You can't even see. Visibility, planes have difficulty landing. That's the amount of pollution that you have. So we traditionally think that it leads to COPD or asthma or bronchitis or cough or respiratory, upper respiratory, lower respiratory, even lung cancer. But we are not thought it will produce diabetes and obesity. It's a completely different. So in 3 different studies, we showed new onset diabetes increasing, new onset hypertension increasing, and new obesity and dyslipidemia also directly linked to. So we are opening up metabolic syndrome due to a different etiology altogether. To me, it gives me an opportunity to, can we get rid of those habits and give them a different way of disposing of them and reduce the pollution? Can that lead to a decrease in new onset diabetes in the next 5 years if we do that? So that opens up a completely different possibility from the public health angle, which is actually good that new such etiologies which are preventable actually been found.
Well, and just a tremendous example of the power of epidemiologic investigation to elucidate new mechanisms of diabetes prevention. I think that's terrific, and to help a problem that has so many other adverse health effects. And I'm wondering, Dr. Mohan, if you could give us your thoughts on how lessons learned from the epidemiology of type 2 diabetes in South Asians can be used to turn the tide of the global diabetes epidemic.
I think the lessons that we have learned, I've mentioned several times during this interview that we are like 10 or 15 years behind the West. And many of the mistakes which the advanced societies have done, we made the same mistakes, obviously, because of fast foods and all the junk foods and the high energy foods, and then the lack of exercise and all those mistakes that we made. Now that has driven the curves sharply up. and in terms of epidemiology. Now, if you think of nations which are now developing, Africa is a very good example. There are some 40, 42 countries in Africa where they are like 10 years behind what South Asia was, what India is. And the diabetes rates are just beginning to go up. If these things can be applied there, can we reduce the pollution in those places? Can we encourage physical activity in children right from school so that there's no childhood obesity, or childhood obesity comes down and therefore it doesn't translate into adult obesity? And can we encourage taking more protein and healthy fats like the monounsaturated fats or the polyunsaturated fat, less of saturated fat, no trans fats, and include more protein, cut the carbs, and overall ensure better nutrition? And there are other things like, for example, one of the things I didn't discuss, why the diabetes in India might have increased, particularly in the youth, is lack of sleep. Now, interesting though they may seem, or intriguing though it may seem, when the economy opened up, one of the countries which the young Indians were working for was America, because a lot of outsourcing occurred. You'd have heard about the IT industry and how in Bangalore or in Chennai or Hyderabad, some of the South Indian cities are actually the hubs for IBM or for many of the other big people to big companies to have their back office in India. Now, guess what time they're all working? They're all working the night because they're working to American timings, So while it's good, they're paid in dollars, they make a lot of money. What do they eat in the night when they're working? They're not getting their mother's food at 2 a.m., 3 a.m. So they're buying fast foods and eating. The sleep is gone. The circadian rhythm is affected. They put on weight. They don't have time to exercise because then all night they are working and daytime they're sleeping. And so everything is upset. So there are good things that we can learn, but also there are a lot of bad effects of acculturization or globalization. While the economy improves and everything improves, it does take a toll on people's health. And those are all lessons which we can learn. Can we use artificial intelligence to use some of that so that we still keep our sleep? And then, get AI to do some of those jobs, not the human being actually sitting there whole night and doing that. But can they get some sleep and then replace part of it with the AI? I'm just thinking, there are many solutions which can be found so that the same mistakes don't occur in all the other countries in the world. And 20 years later, somebody comes to give a Kelly West lecture and say, well, all these things we also did, and we also have landed in the same place as India did, So can we use this to prevent it in some of the other countries? And that's why these lessons learned, the title itself, it comes. So I think these lessons are universal. Pollution is going to increase in many countries. So can we reduce that pollution? Can we wear masks? Any other method of reducing that? Can we prevent obesity from the rapid rise that is occurring? Back to basics. I think why our forefathers didn't have it was they slept enough, they didn't overwork, they ate the right food, they had a lot of fiber in their diet, they didn't eat junk foods, they exercised, they were mostly agriculturists working in the field, so they burnt the calories that they ate, and all that went wrong, with economic development. On a lighter note, when we first wrote about this, how with affluence the diabetes increased, we had a humorous British reviewer. So he said, probably the British should come back and make you poor again, and then all your diabetes will go. So it's not that you should become poor again to reverse it, but how can you remain affluent and still not get the diseases? That's a challenge. And I think there are solutions to that. You still exercise every day and you still eat reasonably healthy food and sleep on time and sleep enough. And these are, I think, basic human necessities. If you follow that, I think there will be some rise in diabetes because as you grow older, you will get lifespan will increase, and age is a non-modifiable risk factor. Family history is a non-modifiable risk factor. Certain things you can't avoid, but certain things you can avoid. And I always say that it's not to get rid of diabetes, which we should aim for, but to get rid of the complications of diabetes. You can have diabetes, but you should not go blind. You shouldn't have amputations, no kidney failure, no heart attacks due to diabetes, no impotence due to diabetes. If you can rule that out, So what if you have a little diabetes? It probably help you to do all the right things because you're forced to do it, which others may not do. So I say that a well-controlled person with diabetes is probably better off than somebody without diabetes.
And Dr. Mohan, what final takeaway messages do you have for our listeners?
Diabetes is something which probably is very difficult to eliminate from the face of the earth. Maybe type 1 diabetes, we may find a cure. But something like type 2 diabetes, which is a lifestyle disorder, it's very difficult to eliminate it completely. We should try our best to identify people who are at high risk, the pre diabetic people, and try to prevent diabetes in them. Identify type 2 diabetes early so that we can either halt it there or even reverse it in the early stages by weight loss and other things if you're in the early stages. As you go further down the natural history of diabetes, control the diabetes well and follow the ABC mantra, what I call as A is A1C. Keep that under good control, below 7% or 6.5. B is blood pressure. Keep that under good control. C is cholesterol. So keep that under good control. Your LDL cholesterol under good control. And D stands for discipline. Some little bit of diet, exercise, sleep, and all the no excess alcohol, no tobacco in any form, or give up smoking, and so on. If you follow this ABCD mantra, I think everybody with diabetes can have a long and healthy life. And the other award I got from the American Diabetes Association 8 years before I got the Kelly West was the Harold Rifkin Award from the American Diabetes. And that award is given to me for showing that people with type 2 diabetes can live 40, 50 or more years without complications if they follow this A, B, C, D mantras. We had a group of survivors and non-survivors, and the survivors who had lived for 40, 50 years just had their A1C, blood pressure, and cholesterol under control. And that was enough for them to have a long and healthy life. So I would say it's a positive message. Doesn't matter if you have diabetes, achieve these ABC, and then you can have a long and healthy life despite diabetes.
Those are important lessons for all of us. Dr. Viswanathan Mohan, thank you so much for sharing your expertise with us today. I really appreciate all I've learned, both from your paper and our discussion, at the critically important problem and unique characteristics of type 2 diabetes in South Asians. I encourage our listeners to access the full article in the February issue of Diabetes Care. Let's move on now to our rapid exchange segment where Alice and I chat about some of the articles we found particularly interesting this month. Alice, what is your first pick?
Well, my first pick, Mike, addresses the very real and sometimes underappreciated issue of eating disorders among women with type 1 diabetes. We know that young women with type 1 diabetes have a 2 to 3-fold increased prevalence of eating disorders compared to peers without diabetes. The Body Project is an effective eating disorder prevention program in the general population, and it was adapted to diabetes and named the Diabetes Body Project. Dr. Mireille Hennekes and colleagues from the Netherlands, Norway, and the United States performed the first fully powered randomized control trial to investigate the effects of the Diabetes Body Project in a multinational study of 293 women with type 1 diabetes aged 14 to 35 years who expressed some level of body dissatisfaction. Participants were randomly assigned to the Diabetes Body Project intervention, which consisted of 6 one-hour virtual sessions in groups of 6 to 8, led by 2 facilitators, 1 clinician and 1 peer educator with type 1 diabetes, or randomized to education control, which consisted of freely available videos delivered by email. Participants allocated to the Diabetes Body Project group showed significantly greater improvements in eating disorder symptoms and behaviors, pursuit of the thin appearance ideal, body dissatisfaction, and dietary restraint, as well as diabetes distress and diabetes-related quality of life compared to the control participants. The authors conclude that this brief, low-cost, virtual eating disorder prevention intervention has the potential for broad implementation.
That is welcome news, Alice, as eating disorders are a really under-recognized problem, especially for young women. And I hope that having effective interventions that are straightforward to implement will help raise awareness and questioning of our patients with type 1 diabetes by providers. Another underrecognized problem for individuals with type 1 diabetes is the experience of severe hypoglycemia. In my first pick, Dr. Lori Leffel from the Joslin Diabetes Center and Harvard Medical School in Boston, Massachusetts, and colleagues examined survey data and 1 year of continuous glucose monitoring data from 926 individuals with type 1 diabetes in the Type 1 Diabetes Exchange Registry online community. Despite more than 50% of the respondents reporting use of an automated insulin delivery or AID system, of those on AID, almost 30% were not meeting the recommended target of spending more than 70% of time in the normal glucose range of 70 to 180 milligrams per deciliter or 3.9 to 10 millimoles per liter. And about 16% both reported having experienced a severe hypoglycemia event and exhibited clinically significant hypoglycemia events based on sensor glucose readings less than 54 milligrams per deciliter or 3 millimoles per liter by continuous glucose monitoring. These findings again highlight a significant proportion of the population with type 1 diabetes continue to have an unmet need and require even more novel interventions than we have with automated insulin delivery to achieve recommended glycemic control.
Yeah, I think this really highlights that although what we have is really, really great, it's not perfect. And there's still the human pancreas when functioning at its optimal that we're still trying to mimic. So I think that the tools we have are really good, but the continued research is absolutely required. And I think also speaks to the human component of this because all of our systems still very much require human intervention and that increased burden that brings. And one day, Mike, before you and I retire, perhaps that will be eliminated and there'll be something that will truly be as automatic as a biological pancreas doing its job. So we'll keep our fingers crossed. Now, my second pick addresses a very serious trend that has come up in the last couple of years, which is that of compounded GLP-1 and dual GIP-GLP-1 receptor agonists. Now, this February 2025 issue of Diabetes Care contains a statement from the American Diabetes Association on this very topic, led by Dr. Joshua Neumiller, which includes a number of guidance statements that are really useful. There's a clear statement that the ADA recommends against the use of non-FDA-approved compounded GLP-1 and dual GIP-GLP-1 receptor agonist products due to safety, quality, and effectiveness concerns, and uncertainty about their content. Dosing errors and adverse events with compounded products are reviewed, along with highlighting the significant concerns around counterfeit products that have appeared. In fact, there is a table in the document of key warning signs that an online pharmacy or distributor of compounded products may be unsafe, something worth considering putting up on display in your clinic. In addition, there's an important section on resources and advice if someone still elects to use a compounded product. Very useful and very important resources.
Yes, this is a super helpful resource, Alice, and also contains helpful recommendations on making GLP-1 agonist substitutions for our patients if the one they're on becomes temporarily unavailable at their pharmacy or their insurance coverage changes. And for our patients with type 2 diabetes, both achieving and maintaining improvements in glycemic control with GLP-1 agonists and other approaches is so important for preventing future complications. So for my next pick, Dr. Toshiaki Okuma from the George Institute for Global Health in Sydney, Australia, and colleagues analyzed data from over 11,000 participants with type 2 diabetes in the ADVANCE trial by age at diagnosis and diabetes duration, and found that intensive glucose lowering reduced the risk for the composite primary outcome of major macro and microvascular events, as well as for death, cardiovascular death, and each major macrovascular event for all categories of disease onset and duration. So once as providers, we find an agent or a combination of agents that enables a patient to achieve intensive glucose lowering, a change in coverage or insurance denial becomes an understandably inexplicable problem for both the patient and their provider.
Absolutely. And I think this really shows or reemphasizes, I should say, the importance of glycemic control and trying to maintain that as much as possible. And I think we also have a job as clinicians to continue to encourage and motivate patients to continue to use the therapies that we're offering because, again, the burden of doing all that can certainly start to compound on the individual. Now, my last pick is a bit of a glimpse into the future and some reassurance that we remain relevant. Dr. James Fleury and colleagues from Memorial Sloan Kettering in New York conducted a study to explore how the commercially available large language model, GPT-4, compares to endocrinologists when addressing hypothetical diabetes clinical vignettes with no single right answer. The primary outcome was the choice of metformin or another initial antihyperglycemic therapy. In the study, the GPT-4 responses were superficially reasonable and aligned with clinical guidelines regarding use of metformin in people with impaired kidney function. However, there were meaningful differences between the responses from GPT-4 and endocrinologists. These were most evident in the interpretation of relative contraindications. So, for example, GPT-4 favored newer drug classes over metformin and had a rigid reluctance to using metformin in people with a history of GI distress. It was found, however, that prompt engineering, or as I interpret it, tweaking the prompts until the answers were more closely matching those of the clinicians, worked really well and may need to be incorporated into any future clinical applications. But for now, it looks like you and I, Mike, remain relevant, sort of.
Well, in rationalizing the use of newer and more expensive drug classes, my sense is that we have a tendency to oversell the downsides of older options, which might explain the information GPT-4 used to derive its reluctance to initiate metformin in those with any history of gastrointestinal distress. And as practitioners, experience has guided us through conversations with our patients and observations of their responses that GPT-4 or whatever's next we'll never know unless that all ends up incorporated into that prompt engineering or tweaking model. But I will say I am a little afraid, Alice, that despite that experiential knowledge will only be relevant as long as our younger colleagues still ask us for our opinion rather than the robots. Now, where I would welcome use of artificial intelligence is in the implementation of genetic risk scores in refining our diagnostic classification of individuals with diabetes. We've covered a lot on this topic over the last 2 years, and for the latest on genetic risk scores, my last pick involves a tie. Dr. Carolyn McGraw from the University of California, San Diego, and colleagues explored non-HLA DR3 or DR4 genetic risk. So HLA DR3 and DR4 carrying the highest risk alleles for type 1 diabetes. So for those who don't have those high risk alleles, what's the other genetic risk for type 1 diabetes, which still develops in those individuals among over 12,000 people? And they identified 18 type 1 diabetes risk variants and formulated a genetic risk score for non-HLA DR3, DR4 genetic risk that highly discriminated those with type 1 diabetes from type 2 diabetes and no diabetes. And the second on this topic of genetic risk comes from Miss Emily Drismala from the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, Atlanta, Georgia, and colleagues who examined the additive value of considering type 2 diabetes genetic risk in addition to family history for predicting future type 2 diabetes. And among almost 110,000 individuals, the polygenic risk score outperformed family history, affecting a first degree relative for predicting future type 2 diabetes. But it did the best when you actually combine the family history with the type 2 diabetes polygenic risk score. So I feel these two articles, again, highlight the increasing uses for evaluating genetic risk in both diabetes diagnosis and perhaps one day prevention.
And really showcases us getting closer and closer to the concept of precision medicine, or really being able to fine tune and pinpoint. But you're right, I would appreciate having a tool of some sort to do that calculation for me, because there's so many of these now, and there's no way I'm going to remember to do them. But if the technology could sort of help spit that out on the screen when I see someone and allow us to help better predict, I think that'd be beautiful. Well, this brings us to the end of the February 2025 episode of Diabetes Care on Air. Thank you to Doctors Klara Klein and Viswanathan Mohan for sharing their expertise with us, and congratulations again for their featured articles.
And a big thank you to you, our listeners, for tuning in. Remember that Diabetes Care is continuing to take submissions of original art for consideration to be included on a future journal cover. Don't forget to subscribe to get notifications about new episodes of this podcast. Thank you for listening.